to part 2. So you've probably heard me say complex trauma a couple of times today, and I know Heather when she introduced me, she said that I specialize in developmental trauma. So I actually specialize in both developmental and complex trauma. And so developmental trauma is trauma that you experience during your developmental stages. And so anybody who had any of those like ACEs that we talked about earlier today, developmental trauma is the trauma that you experience, that stuff that you experienced growing up. So if you were in a chaotic environment or a punitive environment or whatever, if you experienced neglect or abuse, any of that stuff that happened during childhood impacts your development because you're going through the developmental stages when you're experiencing it. And we'll talk a little bit about that. But complex trauma, you've probably heard me say a couple of times too. Does anybody know what complex trauma is?
The little I know about it is that it's not one thing, it's several things. But that's all that I know.
Okay, yeah. It's pretty much, that is pretty much all there is to it.
Oh.
As far as like understanding what's happening or why it happens is that just like, so if we go back to our earlier definition of trauma being a response that takes longer, or an experience that we respond to and our response takes longer to go back to a normal, like comfortable, safe point of being. Complex trauma is like, say you experienced something, you experienced a situation in which you were activated, your brain was activated, it released the stress hormones, and before you went back to being regulated, you experienced another trauma. And so complex trauma is stacking of traumas. You experienced one on top of another before you were able to heal from the first. And many of us experience one on top of another, on top of another, on top of another, on top of another. And so because of that, our symptoms meld together. I mean, we can't be like, well, I'm experiencing this specific symptom because of this specific experience, because it's really compounded of all of the symptoms of all the experiences, and they're intertwined. And so that's why people who find that, like, even if they've really worked through a specific traumatic experience, still have a lot of the symptoms, it's because the symptoms aren't always linked to that one when you have multiple experiences.
I think of it this way, like, because I probably would be considered that because I had multiple experiences when I was growing up in childhood. So probably both for me. I think of it almost like you can have like a tangled ball of yarn, but if anyone here does any kind of needlework and you've put several balls of yarn together and you didn't really like pay attention to what you were doing, or the cat got involved or something like that, then you can pull one thread and all of a sudden it pulls this whole snarl of other things, and it takes a lot of effort to disentangle it on a physical scale. It's not perfectly analogous, but that's what I think of, because oftentimes when I start working on one thing, a whole host of other things come with it, because they're all kind of connected together, at least in my mind, or because of the fact that they occurred in really close proximity to each other.
Yeah, yes, I think that's a perfect example. Absolutely. I don't think I need to define it beyond that. I think that's a really, really good way to explain it. Because everybody understands that. Does that make sense to everyone?
I'm sorry for those of you who don't do needlework.
I don't do needlework, but I still follow that. Good. So we're going to talk about some of the symptoms that come. So with a standard like trauma, like if you had one traumatic experience, it's actually kind of fairly not easy, but like it's not that complicated to treat a single experience. But when you have the like rat's nest of yarn, it makes it really, really, really difficult to treat. And so complex trauma, especially when complex trauma is combined with developmental trauma, it really impacts every aspect of a person's life. Like, there's not an aspect of a person's life that isn't somehow impacted by the symptoms of complex and developmental trauma. And so with the symptoms that show up, like with a standard one-time event, you could have things like hypervigilance, where you're on edge and you're afraid that something's going to happen and you have to be prepared to run or fight all the time. Or like where you experience some kind of trigger that brings a flashback and you feel like you're in the experience again. What are some other symptoms that are just basic trauma? Feeling, emotional dysregulation, so you have a hard time regulating your emotions. Like, all of these symptoms are hard enough when they're on their own, but when you add in the complexity of complex trauma, they really impact a person's ability to interact with other people, to have healthy relationships, to respond in environments that for most people, or people who don't have complex trauma, can just be, like in this room, for example. If you're having a hard time being in this room with other people, literally it's like part of traumatic experience or trauma response. Like, it just really impacts every aspect of your life. Yeah, Susan, you were going to ask a question.
So you're talking about trauma as like a horrible thing that happens, okay? But then what happens when this horrible thing happens, and then for the next indefinite amount of time it continues to surround you? Is that complex trauma, or is that something different? Or is that just plain trauma?
If it's a continuous experience and event, like long term, it would be complex trauma.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah,
Yeah,
absolutely.
I was wanting to ask you, with survivor's guilt, would that be considered like a form of trauma, or would it just be like a symptom of trauma?
It is definitely a symptom of trauma, for sure. Yeah. So for those who didn't hear what he asked about survivor's guilt. That is for sure one, it's a very common experience, especially if you have like one of those big trauma events and you survive and other people don't. Like if you were in a car accident, or if you were in a natural disaster, or if you're in combat, survivor's guilt of questioning, why was I the one to survive? Why did I make it through and other people didn't? Is a really common symptom of trauma.
Survivor's guilt, and I'll also just point out, for those of us either in the military or EMS, survivor's guilt does serve an adaptive function. It allows us to deal with the grief of that, over a longer period of time, because it's easier for us to judge ourselves than it is to face the hard emotions of having witnessed somebody's death, right? So it is easier for us to, we'll focus on that and all the things we did wrong, rather than having to actually set aside the time, feel that emotion, process it with safe people.
And by the way, that actually, I can relate to that too, because I survived my mother's death. And so it's not just, it's definitely for people in the medical field and military who've experienced that, but it might also be for those who have experienced an untimely death in their family, or something like that too. Just speaking from my personal experience.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So
I definitely did react in that way, by the way. It's much easier to beat up on yourself than it is to actually deal sometimes with that amazing grief.
the grief, yeah, the grief process. And so there are two symptoms tend to fall in one of two ways, or two categories. So symptoms fall, particularly for complex trauma, they fall either in adapting skills or mitigating skills. So what we're doing like, especially when it comes to like our behaviors as a way of responding to the experiences, we're either adapting to the environment or we're trying to distance ourselves from it as a way to survive it. So, like, if we go back to like adapting skills, being unable to control our emotions and lashing out at people, or being really irritable, or like yelling at people when we don't necessarily feel like we have control of that, is an adaptation to the environment. Does that make sense? Am I making sense right now? Versus like mitigating, we dissociate, or we keep really busy, and we're going to talk a lot about this in the trauma types, which is next. It's part 3 is the 4 trauma types. Mitigating could be like keeping ourselves really busy so we don't have to slow down to feel the feelings, or obsessing about things, having to be perfect again to avoid feeling the experience or being present in the experience of whatever the toxic environment is that we're dealing with. Does that make sense to everyone? I see some like smiles of like, are you relating over there? Maybe. When we get to part 3, and I might kind of like, part 3 is really, really important in the trauma types. But when we get to that, you'll go, oh my gosh, like this is definitely me, right? Every time I have a conversation with a client and I tell them about the 4 trauma types, they're immediately like, oh yeah, this is me. Oh, and this is my mom, and this is my best friend, and like, so we'll get to that. So I think I might kind of go, because that's a really, really important topic, we're going to kind of skim past this, go through this quickly and get to part 3, because I really want you all to have the time to really process the 4 trauma types that really talk more in detail about like adapting skills and mitigation skills.
Yeah, I was going to say, I'm still not entirely clear on the adapting skill. Just give one example.
Okay, adapting. So if you think about like a child who is having behavioral problems in school, what kind of symptom or what kind of behavioral problems would you see for a child who's like in a chaotic
They might
environment?
be hitting somebody. They might hit somebody.
They might be aggressive. What else could they be doing? They could be shy and withdrawn. Yep. Yep, that was me.
Bullying people.
Huh?
Could they be bullying others?
They could be bullying.
Or the class clown.
Or they could be the class clown. Yes.
Well,
That's.
They could be the one being bullied.
They could be the one that's getting bullied. But that wouldn't. Well, but like maybe they're getting bullied and they're not able to do anything about it, so they like just like kind of try to take it and like hide or like stay quiet to try to avoid the.
Would you say fawning and freezing might be part of that?
Fawning is, freezing's not. Freezing is a mitigation.
Okay.
But, so that's what we're gonna go into, in part 3, is, yeah, but does that make sense?
It helps me to wrap my brain around it.
Does that make more sense that adapting is like, whatever the environment is, you either become like aggressive to protect yourself, or you become like tiny and to avoid the problem, or you want to make people happy, or like whatever. They're adapting to the environment so that they feel safe, right? And so our symptoms tend to come out as a result of either adapting to the environment or trying to avoid it. Okay, so a quick like summary of impact on development. When we're growing up, when we're first born, the only part of our brain that's fully developed coming out of the womb is our what's often called like the lizard brain is this like brainstem area. Okay? And this brainstem area is focused on survival. Its only goal is to keep us alive. So we come out born knowing how to breathe. We're born knowing how to cry, how to sleep, how to eat, how to poop, right? All of those things that we do instinctively, unconsciously that is the only part of the brain that's fully developed when we're born. We develop the other aspects of our brain as we age. And when you're experiencing an environment that is inconsistent, or you don't have a caretaker who is attuned to your needs, this significantly impacts your ability to develop healthy communication skills. Like literally the part of your brain that deals with communication isn't developing at the same rate and in the same way as somebody who has a caretaker who's attuned to them. Your ability to understand your experiences, your emotional experiences. Somebody earlier asked about the amygdala. Your amygdala processes emotions. Your ability to understand what you're experiencing and put words to it, and to regulate through those emotions is significantly impacted. That impacts your ability to connect with other people, to feel safe in other people's presence, to understand how you relate to other people and to the world. And so a lot of times people with complex and developmental trauma grow up with this like lack of understanding of how they fit into the world. They oftentimes feel like they don't belong. And that's because that part of development isn't nurtured when you don't have a caretaker who is attuned to your needs growing up. Or when you're in an environment that is toxic, that is chaotic, that is stressful. When the caretakers don't know how to self-regulate, they can't teach the children as they're developing how to self-regulate. And so this literally that impacts your ability to develop, your brain's ability to develop in a healthy way. And so for those of us who did have these experiences in childhood, as an aside, everyone who here, I introduced my mama earlier. My mama's worried that I like talk about my trauma history. She is not my biological mother. She adopted me last year. That's another story. She is not the one who She did not make me crazy. It wasn't her fault. I love you, Mama. Okay, anyways, I forgot where I was going with that. But okay, for those of us who grew up in an environment that didn't nurture our needs, who didn't have a caretaker to be attuned to our needs, and to teach us how to regulate and all of that, this is the reason why we have a hard time making friends. This is the reason why we have a hard time feeling like we belong. This is a reason why we end up like repeating the same patterns over and over again and not really sure why we keep getting ourselves into these situations over and over again. Why can't we learn? Because our brain's development didn't develop in the same way that somebody who had a caretaker who was attuned to their needs.
Is there a solution for that?
Yes, there is a solution for that. And the solution for that, well, is a couple of things. One, finding a good therapist is really a good idea. Because the therapist's job, my job as a therapist, is to be attuned to my clients' needs and to be a mirror back to my clients so that they can understand what it is they're experiencing and how to put words to it and how to self-regulate through it in the same way that a caretaker would if they were a child in development. And so that's the first part. But if you don't have a good therapist, finding somebody who is, so like my mama is somebody who is that for me. We met like 5 years ago and she adopted me last year, legally adopted me last year. She was that person for me who could reflect back to me and show me how to like understand and deal with my emotions. So like it doesn't have to be a therapist. It can be somebody who you're close with. It can be a partner or a friend or whatever. But if you have that one person, that's really important. And then the other thing is that it's really important to learn how to do that for yourself. So one of the things that happens when we don't have somebody to reflect back to us what we're experiencing or how to like understand it, we question our own experiences constantly. Maybe I'm crazy. Maybe I didn't really experience that. Maybe I'm making this up. Maybe it's all in my head. Right? I see some head nods, right? Like that happens because we didn't have someone there to teach us how to trust our own experiences. So part of recovery is learning how to be in attunement with yourself and to care for your own self and to validate your own experiences and to put words to your experiences and to set boundaries. And the way to get there is doing things like self-reflection, doing things like journaling, doing things like meditation, giving yourself the opportunity to slow down and actually check in with yourself. What is it that I'm actually experiencing right now? What is it that I'm feeling? Because this stuff is happening unconsciously, and if we don't slow down and check in with ourselves, we're not going to be attuned to our own needs. So part of recovery from complex trauma is not only finding somebody else to reflect back to us, but also learning how to do that for ourselves so that we can learn to feel safe with ourselves and trust ourselves. Does that make sense?
Yes.
Yeah, good question.
So is there ways of identifying the difference between just a natural slowing development over a slowing development due to trauma?
Well, so I have to admit that I don't have much experience with like developmental disorders. And so like working with people who have developmental disorders, I don't know how you would distinguish like what of it is because of something that is like a biological thing and what of it is because of trauma. But I will say that people who have developmental disorders most certainly are at higher risk of experiencing traumatic experiences and not having caretakers attuned to their needs. So they're definitely going to have, at least in part, some of these symptoms because they didn't have someone to care for them and be attuned to them and to show them how to regulate. So even if some of their, or even if the majority of their symptoms are a result of some kind of biological disorder, they can still 100% benefit from having the same type of treatment of learning how, or like connecting with somebody, learning how to trust themselves and their experiences, learning how to verbalize it, learning how to regulate through it. Does that make sense? And does that answer your question? Okay.
Sorry. this gorgeous thing, it says bullshit.
Yeah.
I was looking for one to color.
We do, yeah, some of the coloring pages do have cuss words on it. Yeah, Don.
Is there a time limit?
Like, are you asking if you could be too old to heal?
Yeah,
No.
so
At least not in part, I mean, you may not, anybody at any age is capable of starting the healing process. Now, can I say, that you could ever completely heal? I don't know that you could ever completely heal no matter what age you are. Complex trauma is something that is complex. And, even as a person who has been in therapy most of my life and a person who very intensely does my own work and my own treatment for myself and has really great loving support in my life, I still have symptoms and I probably will for the rest of my life. But I'm a whole hell of a lot better than I was 5 years ago. And so I think that can be true for anybody, no matter what their age, that they can start to heal. And so that at least at the end of their lives they have, some healing and some relief so that they can start to enjoy what life they have left.
So you're saying that you're now in tune with yourself?
I'm not always, but a whole lot more than I was, yeah. Yeah, I'm pretty good at identifying what it is that I'm feeling and experiencing. My mama can speak on my behalf for that. Like, I'm really good at being like, oh, I'm really experiencing this, or this is really impacting me in this way, and like slowing down and being able to verbalize it, and also then go, okay, this is what I need to do to help me feel better. And I'm always doing that, and like constantly. I always am constantly. I'm at the point now where, like, as soon as I start to feel some symptoms, I go, oh wait, something's happening. And I slow down and I check in with myself. And I do, like, and if I can't in the moment, then I process it with my therapist. I meet with my therapist every week. Okay, any questions on how complex trauma impacts development?
I was going to make an observation.
Okay.
Something that has helped me to cross some of those bridges, and I think this is common with other fields as well, is music. And you know, so if you're dealing with some issues or whatever, oftentimes music will help with that whole process of sometimes putting things into words. I mean, I think we've all had that experience of having a song where you want to raise your light or two or whatever.
Your cell phone now.
You know what I'm saying?
Yeah.
Well, I know now it's phones, right? But in all seriousness, I mean, they've done studies on Alzheimer's and how that can also, help bring the regulation of emotion back into balance. People will feel a little bit more comfortable.
Yep.
Sometimes even help them make more connections with people while they're even still dealing with, with that.
Yeah. Music can absolutely be a very powerful tool, and it's one of my favorites. And we'll talk, when we get to part 4, we're going to talk more about self-regulation, and that'll be part of it. Okay. We kind of talked about that. Yeah.
Okay. Go ahead and do a drawing. We have a door prize, so.
Okay.
Look at him.
All right.
He's the lucky winner.
Haley.
Where's Haley? All right.
Okay, since we just kind of came back from a break, instead of going to break, how is everybody feeling? Are you feeling okay to keep going, moving on?
Yeah.
Everyone okay to keep moving on? Nobody needs a break? Okay. So, we're going to talk about self-soothing. Actually, that's actually a really good introduction to self-soothing. All right. Thank you. Okay, so what's going around now is a worksheet on self-soothing. And self-soothing is essentially things, it's a way, like if we were, when we're babies, well actually I'm going to wait until you guys are all paying attention. Okay, so can I get your attention? So before you go through the whole list, I want to explain what self-soothing is and why it's so helpful. So if we go back to just a couple minutes ago, I was talking about if you grow up in an environment with a caretaker who is attuned to your needs and teaches you how to self-regulate, one of the things that caretakers who are attuned to the children do is help them to soothe. So if you think about soothing like a baby, what are the ways that caretakers soothe babies? How does somebody soothe a baby? Oh, sorry, I thought you were raising your hand.
Those get
Rocking,
they're
singing.
Rocking, singing, what else?
Give them to a babysitter.
That is not self-attunement, no. or attunement to the baby, yeah. Oh,
Gentle touch.
gentle touch, okay,
Maybe a
yeah.
bath.
Giving them a bath, a warm bath, yeah.
Laughter.
Laughter, okay, yeah.
Patting on the butt.
Patting them on the butt, yeah.
Did you like say feeding?
Feeding them. I don't think anybody did, but thank you for saying that, yes. Feeding is one of the most common ways to soothe a baby, right?
Chris. How about swaddling?
Swaddling, yeah, right, okay, so all of these things are activities that are soothing to babies that caretakers do for the children. And children learn, if they have a caretaker who is attuned to their needs, eventually they start to learn how to self-soothe. So they start to learn how to rock themselves or wrap themselves in a blanket or whatever. Like they learn to do things that are soothing to themselves, hence the word self-soothing, right? But for people who grew up without a caretaker who's attuned to their needs, they really don't learn how to self-soothe. And so as adults, sometimes we need to learn to, we have to teach ourselves how to self-soothe. This list that I gave you, that I handed out, is a list of ideas of how to self-soothe. And what you want to do is think about your 5 senses and think about things that are comforting to those 5 senses. Okay? Does that make sense? Okay, so now we're going to take a few minutes to read over that list, and then we're going to do an activity that Heather's going to be leading. Do you want to sit here or do you?
How much more time should I give you?
Maybe one more minute.
A few more seconds and then we'll. Okay, so on this little bit of self-soothing, but also using our senses to help us come out of dissociation. I am one of those trauma survivors that also has DID, a dissociative disorder. And one of the things that was very hard for me was to be able to even identify body sensations like hunger or satiation when I was full. I couldn't sense in my body messages from my body of pain, which meant that a lot of times when I'd be sick, I wouldn't realize it while I was just beginning to get sick. And that creates problems with people not being able to get the care they need early on. And that kind of disconnect, and you'll see that in people with developmental trauma, especially if meal times might have been really hard for them, that they don't necessarily have a connection to what they eat. So one of the things that I was taught to help me when I am dissociating, if I eat when I'm dissociated, it just goes right through my stomach. That fight or flight is engaged, and so it shuts down your intestinal tract. And the average woman with PTSD will be misdiagnosed 6 times and wait 12 years between when she first seeks help her symptoms, and she finally gets her adequate trauma diagnosis. And that is problematic. So we can teach people how to help themselves with this. So one of the things that they taught me to do was to help myself ground before meals so that I wouldn't just lose all my nutrition, because I actually had malnutrition from it. It affected my weight. I was misdiagnosed with irritable bowel syndrome and spent so much money on tests and medications. And then after I went through trauma training and some of this, all that stuff just kind of got fixed. So don't need those medications anymore. So what I do is, whatever the food I'm presented with, I try very hard to use as many senses as I can. So I would describe this as cool to the touch. The texture of it is kind of smooth but a little bit bumpy. It's orange. It has a lot of different colors of orange. There's a little bit of green, so I'm engaging the different senses. I'm naming what I see. I might smell it. I might slow down when I eat it. So when I peel it, let more of that scent come up. And just breathe it in and let myself experience what it feels like to be able to put it on my lips, what it feels like in my mouth. I describe it as either sweet or salty or umami. Is that right? Is that what we decided that one was? Umami?
Savory.
Yeah. To just slow down the experience of it so that at the beginning of the meal, I'm making sure I'm not dissociated. I'm getting the benefit of it, and I can enjoy my food. And also my body can then, because I'm no longer dissociated, my body is no longer telling my entire digestive tract, oh, that's not a priority, you might have to run, so we're not going to hold on to anything. And I don't know if you've ever known anyone who had to go to the bathroom like right after they ate. That was what my life was, and the doctors had told me that would be a part of my life the rest of my life when I was still a teenager. And I just accepted that. And then in trauma therapy, they taught me differently, and now that's just not a problem for me unless I have too many days in a row of too much trauma. So that's what I do now with my meals, whatever it may be. But the other thing I learned is to ask myself, what is it I'm really hungry for? Because there are times I need crunchy food because I'm anxious, and I find that, but I no longer just grab the whole bag of chips and just kind of dissociative eating, and I used to do that. Now I just set aside a little bit and I try to crunch through the whole chip enough until finally my brain recognizes, oh, we're doing an activity, and we're doing an activity with my body, and then I can start feeling my body, and then I actually feel full from an adequate amount of food without eating so much that I feel ill later. And I've lost almost 50 pounds without dieting. Of course, I also am a medical cannabis user as well. But yeah, being able to ground yourself using whatever food you have available is always an option, and it's one of the least expensive ones for mindfulness activities. So, you know, maybe you have your go-tos now, and the things I pick crunchy foods that don't necessarily have a lot of calories anymore for when I just need to crunch some things. And because otherwise, you know, those can add up on the tough days. But sometimes I need smooth foods because I'm so anxious that, you know, like a pudding or a hot tea, whatever it is for you. But here's the trick. If you're going to cultivate some type of oral sensory thing as a practice for your own mindfulness activity, make sure you do it regularly when you're feeling safe, when you're feeling grounded. So for me, it's tea. I started drinking warm tea, not because I like tea. I was a coffee drinker all day and I didn't want to give it up, right? But I had started doing it as a mindfulness practice, and now all a friend has to do is put a warm cup of tea in my hands. And if I'm dissociated, I'll start noticing that, and it will remind me, oh, yeah, normally I drink warm tea when I'm sitting there with my dog and we're having fun, just reading and relaxing. And it helps my brain kind of know, even if I'm at work and having a stressful day, I take warm tea, and because I've trained myself at home in my safe space as a trauma, you know, person who has to deal with that, now it's a reminder, and it has its own ability to comfort me.
Can I?
Go ahead.
Sorry, go ahead.
Go ahead.
I'm talking a lot.
No, I would say.
That's all right. I was gonna say, the word is, I think you mentioned like when you have something and you normally eat it or consume it in a different setting like that, when you're watching your dog and stuff like that, like the word that comes to my mind is associations.
Yes.
Because a lot of trauma is related to the associations you make. If there was a particular thing that you saw, a particular smell, and if you take that same thing and you associate it with something that is neutral or calming, then it helps to mitigate that trauma response, and it's not as intense as.
Yeah, and I'll tell you, one of the other things that my therapist had me do in the beginning was to be able to use Altoids, because I would dissociate through my appointments, and you can't process trauma if you're not in the room, right? You can't process trauma if it's too overwhelming. So we learned that if I would put 3 of those in my mouth, it would be a little painful but not dangerous, but it would be a sensation I could not ignore, right? And then she would be responding to me and helping me kind of remember, oh, where I am, come out of flashbacks, and be able to ground myself. And now all I have to do is look at the Altoids tin, and then I can feel my mouth in my head and remind myself, oh, yeah, I wasn't in the room during that. Okay, let's try to do some grounding and start over again. So, but it just takes practice. But I learned this: if you do the same practice every day for 3 weeks, it becomes a habit. But it's really important how you talk to yourself when you're practicing it. Because if I'm trying to take on that new habit and saying, oh God, the whole day, and I should have this, and I should, that's not going to work. It's got to be a time where, look, here's tea. I'm sitting in my favorite chair. I have my dog with me. I have my loved ones on the phone nearby. It trains the brain to associate, right, that act, no matter where I am. So now when I pick up hot tea somewhere, I'm like, I'm good, you know, and my brain just kind of knows to set down.
Thank you, Heather. So let's go ahead and take just a couple of minutes to go ahead and pick up one of those items that are on your table, or a drink or whatever you have, just to do so mindfully. Mindfully experience the texture, the colors, the smells, the taste, all of that. It doesn't have to be the orange specifically. It can be whatever item that you have that you would like to experience. Just do so mindfully.
If anyone's really dissociated right now and you would like a really strong sensation, we do have True Lemon. So this is lemon that is, it's very powerful, you know, so you can sprinkle this on your tongue. And it's very sour. Would anybody like to try it?
I have to say that is not self-soothing. FYI, that is.
This is one that helps me connect out of dissociation. Not that it brings me joy, but it helps me remember where I am. Anybody else? Anybody else want to try it?
It's like concentration. Like a powder.
Yeah, just put it on your tongue and you're getting crystallized lemon.
Hands on.
Yeah, it's more powerful than it looks.
Yeah.
Have your water ready.
It's like a
I have probably 20 Altoids tins at my office that are empty because of this. Yeah.
Okay. I'm gonna pass this out, but don't read it yet. I want you to read it after the end of our next section.
No, it's just good.
Yeah, don't start. I mean, but it's going to be something that we're going to fill out after we have a discussion.
These make a different sound. I haven't messed with this one so much. This will be good for juice. I've been rolling it in my hands the whole time.
That's a self-soothing.
It is, and I do that with rocks too. Unexpected for rock.
Okay, you guys ready for this part 3? Oh, I gotta start the video. Hold on. I gotta stop and then restart the video.